The Hendricks family had always prided themselves on punctuality. Every room in their Victorian home housed at least one timepiece: grandfather clocks, digital displays, ornate wall clocks inherited from generations past. Time was their compass, their constant companion. But on the night of October 13th, time would become their prison. Sarah Hendricks jolted awake, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. Something was wrong, terribly, unnaturally wrong. The silence pressed against her eardrums with an almost physical weight, broken only by her own ragged breathing and the conspicuous absence of the familiar tick-tock that usually lulled her to sleep. She fumbled for her phone on the nightstand, squinting at the screen through bleary eyes. 3:33 a.m., the display read, its blue glow casting sickly shadows across her face. But something was off. The seconds weren't changing. The colon between the numbers didn't blink. It simply remained static, frozen in time like a photograph of the night itself. Panic crept up her spine as she shook her husband Mark awake, his confused grunt dissolving into concern as he saw her pale, terror-stricken face. Together, they crept through their home in their nightgowns and pajamas, checking every timepiece with growing dread. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway stopped at 3:33. The digital microwave display, 3:33. The battery-powered alarm clock in their daughter Emma's room, 3:33. Even their watches, their phones, everything that could measure the passage of time had surrendered to this cursed moment, trapped in amber like prehistoric insects. Their teenage son Jake stumbled downstairs, drawn by their whispered conversations, his usual teenage bravado replaced by genuine fear. 12-year-old Emma followed, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her wide eyes reflecting the strange blue-tinged darkness that seemed to permeate every corner of their home. The family gathered in the living room, surrounded by the silent sentinels of stopped time, each member contributing their own tale of chronological impossibility. Mark, ever the practical engineer, attempted to rationalize the situation. Power surge, he suggested, electromagnetic pulse, solar flare. But even as the words left his lips, they sounded hollow and desperate. Emma's battery-powered travel clock had stopped too. So had Jake's mechanical watch, a gift from his grandfather. The laws of physics seemed to have taken a coffee break, leaving the Hendricks family stranded in a moment that refused to end. It was Jake who first noticed the shadows behaving strangely. At first, it seemed like a trick of the eye, a peripheral movement that vanished when looked at directly. But as they sat in terrified silence, the phenomenon became undeniable. The shadow cast by the lamp moved independently of its source, stretching and contracting like a living thing. The silhouette of their coffee table writhed across the floor, defying the static light above it. Sarah gripped Mark's hand so tightly, her knuckles turned white as bone. The shadows weren't random. They seemed purposeful, almost intelligent. They gathered in corners, pooling like spilled ink, then dispersed and reformed elsewhere. Some appeared to be watching the family, dark voids where faces should be, studying them with an attention that made their skin crawl. Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder, refusing to look at the supernatural dance unfolding around them. The whispers started as a barely perceptible susurration, like wind through autumn leaves. But there was no wind. The night outside was perfectly still, as frozen as time itself. The voices seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, sometimes close enough to feel breath on their necks, other times distant and echoing from rooms they knew were empty. Mark crept toward the kitchen, following one particularly distinct whisper that seemed to be calling his name. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It existed in a space between definitions, unsettling in its ambiguity. As he approached the doorway, the whisper stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. When he peered around the corner, the kitchen was empty, but every cabinet door stood ajar, as if invisible hands had been searching through their contents. Emma, despite her parents' protests, ventured toward the staircase, drawn by whispers that seemed to call her name in her grandmother's voice. But Grandma Rose had been dead for 3 years. As she climbed each step, the whispers grew clearer, more insistent. They spoke of secrets buried in the walls, of times when the house was young and the world was different. They promised to show her things that adults couldn't see, worlds that existed in the spaces between seconds. At the top of the stairs, Emma turned to look back down at her family, but her shadow remained at the bottom, waving at her with movements she wasn't making. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound emerged, as if even her voice had been caught in time's trap. Only when Mark bounded up the stairs and swept her into his arms did the shadow rejoin her body, snapping back like a rubber band released. As the endless 3:33 a.m. stretched on, the house itself seemed to awaken. Doors creaked open on their own, revealing empty rooms that felt occupied. The floorboards groaned under invisible footsteps that followed no discernible pattern. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed a tune that sounded almost like a lullaby, but wrong somehow. The melody twisted and distorted as if played backward. Objects began to move with subtle malevolence. A coffee mug slid across the counter with deliberate slowness. Family photos tilted askew on their hooks, the faces in the pictures seeming to watch the family with expressions that hadn't been there before. The grandfather clock, still frozen at 3:33, began to chime, not the proper Westminster melody, but a discordant series of notes that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Jake, channeling his fear into determination, disappeared into the attic and returned with an armload of dusty documents and photograph albums. His research revealed a disturbing pattern. The house's previous owners had documented similar occurrences dating back over a century. Newspaper clippings told of the Morrison family in 1923, found catatonic in their beds at dawn. All their clocks stopped at 3:33. The Blackwood family in 1967 had fled the house in the middle of the night, leaving behind only a journal entry describing the hour that swallows hours. Each family had experienced the same phenomenon, time stopping at 3:33 a.m., shadows moving independently, whispers from empty rooms. But the documents revealed something more chilling. The occurrences weren't random. They followed a pattern, appearing every 13 years like clockwork, as if the house itself had its own sinister schedule that superseded normal time. In the oldest document they found, a handwritten letter dated 1897, the original owner described the phenomenon in shaking script. The house hungers for time itself, feeding on moments stolen from the living. At 3:33, when the veil between worlds grows thin, it opens its mouth to swallow hours whole. We are not its victims. We are its witnesses, trapped in amber while it feeds. The letter went on to describe how the experience changed people, how those who lived through it were never quite the same. They spoke of feeling untethered from time afterward, of sometimes slipping between moments, of aging slower than they should. The house, it seemed, took more than just time. It took pieces of their temporal souls, keeping them forever connected to that cursed hour. As suddenly as it had begun, the phenomenon ended. Every clock in the house lurched back to life simultaneously, their hands spinning wildly to catch up with lost time. Digital displays flickered through hours of accumulated seconds in moments. The grandfather clock chimed repeatedly, as if celebrating its return to the temporal world. The whispers ceased mid-syllable, the shadows snapped back to their proper positions, and the oppressive silence lifted like fog before dawn. The family checked their phones with trembling hands. It was 6:47 a.m. They had lost over 3 hours to the hungry darkness. 3 hours that existed somewhere outside normal reality. As sunlight began to filter through their windows, painting their living room in warm, normal colors, they held each other close, grateful to be returned to the flowing river of time. But their relief was short-lived. As they cleaned up the scattered documents, Sarah's eyes fell upon Jake's calculations. If the pattern held true, if the house's hunger followed its 13-year cycle, then the next occurrence was already marked in time's calendar. Her blood ran cold as she traced the dates with her finger, counting forward from the last documented incident. She looked up at her family, Mark making coffee with shaking hands, Emma clutching her stuffed rabbit like a lifeline, Jake staring out the window at the normal, time-bound world beyond their cursed home. In 13 years, Emma would be 25, Jake would be 30, and they would all be gathered here again, waiting for 3:33 a.m. to arrive and steal another piece of their lives. The house had marked them now, claimed them as its witnesses, and deep in her heart, Sarah knew that no matter how far they ran, how many times they moved, on October 13th, 13 years from now, they would find themselves back in this living room, watching their clocks freeze at 3:33 a.m., listening for whispers in empty rooms, and waiting for time to remember how to flow again. The house was patient. It had all the time in the world.